I think it's Portugal.
It's Portugal, yeah.
Decriminalized all substances, right? So, and I think their opioid overdose rate decreased like 80%, or astronomically high numbers, right?
Hi, my name is Dan Gomez, and this is Mental Health Super Omnia. Mental health above all. We identify and understand mental health issues and the paths for help. Addicts. Many of us know someone who's an addict. It can have a powerful impact on our perceptions, on our attitudes, and social contexts. And it significantly influences the criminal justice system. To try and understand how people, and particularly the criminal justice system, see addiction, we brought in an expert, Colleen Berryessa. She's an associate professor at Rutgers School of Criminal Justice. Colleen, can you give us the lay of the land here? Summarize your research on addiction and the legal system. Are people treated equally, inappropriately here? Are all addicts, different types of addicts, treated the same? How is this working for us?
Good question. So the area of addiction that I focus on, and it's just a part of my work, it's not the only thing I focus on, is mostly about social stigmatization of addiction and its interaction with the criminal justice system. So how people with addiction and substance abuse disorder are perceived within criminal justice contexts, particularly related to decision makers. So I've done work with different legal actors like judges, and have talked about how they feel about individuals with addiction, especially how that's integrated into sentencing and aftercare. And then I've also done a lot of work on how the public feels about addiction and how they think that should be handled within a criminal justice context. Is it something that is a criminal justice issue? Is it something that's more of a healthcare issue and a medical care issue, but is something that is often handled by the criminal justice system? And then, as you said, not all substances are treated equal in these contexts. People think about addiction in different ways. Societally, people think about alcohol as being very different from a lot of other types of substances, when in fact we know that alcohol, even though it's legal, can be extremely problematic and detrimental, and is honestly much more destructive than most illegal substances. And obviously things like marijuana are now treated and thought of as being very differently as compared to other types of medications. And then right now in the kind of contemporary kind of illicit substance kind of category, we've been talking a lot about the differences in perceptions of heroin versus opioids that are prescription medication like Oxycontin. And so all of those have a very kind of a wide range of stigmas that are associated with them. People think about individuals who take those substances in different ways. And all of that is kind of muddled together to create feelings and experiences and biases towards these individuals, which leads them to end up in situations in the criminal justice system that may not be beneficial for them. So I study it through a variety of different ways, both through interviews and then also through experimental work.
Fascinating. Now, we also have Sam DeFilippo with us here today. She's the leader of the Addictions Recovery Center of Excellence at Equilibria Psychological. Sam, from a mental health perspective, how do you see recovery impacted here, particularly as it relates to people that are still involved in the criminal justice system in one way or another?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Colleen's point, it's a complicated system and dynamic. I think the stigma plays a huge role. So a lot of people won't seek out help when they might need it because of that stigma. I think also with being involved in the legal system, there's just added barriers to receiving treatment and to staying in treatment. I know for some traditional drug and alcohol programs, abstinence is kind of the only method. So you're getting urine tested, and if you're relapsing or if you're using, you're not going to be able to stay in a treatment program. So there's barriers to that. And then if somebody's not completing treatment, they might be violating their probation or their parole and end up back in the legal system. So it's kind of this cycle that is hard to break.
Interesting. And Colleen, when in your studies, are you seeing people view families of addicts in the same light or in a similar light as the addict themselves? How are they treated?
So that's a great question, and is honestly, a part of a study that I conducted several years ago. At this point, was a really surprising finding. So I interviewed a bunch of judges in the state of Pennsylvania, actually, in 2018, and I was interested in how they think about people, defendants with mental disorders, kind of more generally. I talked about a variety of different types of psychiatric diagnoses, including addiction and substance abuse disorder, during my interviews. And the whole idea was trying to figure out whether or not judges show biases towards these individuals, and if that shapes how they stereotype those individuals and how they think about their outcomes, and whether discrimination that may come from those kind of extends to sentencing. And it was, especially focused on an area of kind of psychological bias called essentialism, which is this idea that there are certain qualities that we have about ourselves that are kind of who we are as our essence, like as our true character. And without that kind of essence, we are not actually ourselves. And so, common ones are things like gender and race, but mental disorders and addiction is also very essentialized. It's very much considered as kind of a very core part about that person's identity and character. So talking to these judges, I asked them a bunch of questions about how they thought about defendants, how they handled their cases. And one thing I found, which was, again, something I wasn't necessarily expecting, was I found that judges showed a tremendous amount of stigma towards people who had mental disorders, and that extended to their families, in the sense that there was a lot of stigma by association, which is a psychological concept where people who are close to other individuals who may have stigmatized characteristics are also stigmatized because of their relationship. And so in some cases, it's socially, friends that you hang out with or the people that you surround yourself with. With families, you not only get that social stigmatization, but you also get genetics, stigmatization. You are related to them. You have, obviously shared genetics. And so what I found was that judges often expected or assumed that when a person had a mental disorder, including addiction, that they also expected that people in their family struggled with the same issues, and that those individuals may have had experiences with the criminal justice system, may have had experiences with mental disorders, including addiction, and that there was just, again, a lot of transfer to stigmatization, and a lot of assumptions that basically the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in that regard. And so that was something that was interesting, just because, again, it wasn't expected. We know that family stigma is a thing. It's something that's widely studied in psychology, but I didn't expect it to transfer in kind of sentencing context related to the criminal justice system. And especially that genetic component was really, really interesting, because we know that, many mental disorders, including addiction, are heritable. Addiction is highly heritable. And so in those contexts, there was even maybe a more extreme kind of assumption that if an individual has, addiction or has a substance abuse disorder, that person has come from a parent or a grandparent that has struggled with similar issues, and they may have been shaped or experienced and kind of learned from that behavior, having it been in their family. So it was very, very interesting. But yes, it's definitely, unfortunately, something that families are going to have to combat if their loved one becomes involved in the criminal justice system.
Sam?
I was going to say, that's so interesting, because I feel like most of the time when you hear about stigma related to addiction, it's the opposite. It's the moral feeling of addiction. Like, oh, either parents didn't do something correctly, and that's why my child has a substance use issue, or, the environment that child grew up in or was in even in adulthood, right? We know addiction can start at any point in a span. You would think that the stigma would come from the moral part of it, it was a choice. They picked up that substance and they should be able to stop. So it's interesting that the genetic component is what gets focused on and stigmatized. So we know it's both, right?
It's both, yeah. And I mean, the moral failing is still there. That is not something that's absent. That is definitely something that is still shared. Although what's interesting is, because addiction does touch so many people's lives now, I do think that there's more of an understanding, and we've seen a lot of studies with members of the public, including people in the criminal justice system who work as decision makers in that context as well, that there is less of an assumption that it is a moral failing. They understand that there is a genetic, biological, environmental, social association with the development of addiction. But I think that there is this added familial component, this added kind of genetic component where this assumption that something is highly heritable makes people feel that there has to have been something that these individuals, this lineage, these people that they, this family that they're a part of, there has to be some similarity between these individuals and that other person, even if there's not, and even in other contexts. But it was very surprising too. I agree.
Yeah.
So, I in preparing for today, I ended up talking to a lot of people. I remember talking to this one family, or members of this one family. One of the children had become an addict, gone through recovery multiple times, doing well now. But when you focused in on the siblings, you found this wide range of feelings. In some respect, in some part, it was pity. It was how can I help? But there was also this equal measure of what's wrong with him and why is it you've destroyed our family. Okay. Yeah. Are you seeing a lot of that, Sam? Is that very common? And if so, is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say it's common. It's almost like, have you ever heard of the glass child syndrome, where, in a family where somebody has a chronic illness, one of the children has a chronic illness or has more medical needs or emotional needs than the other child can often feel overlooked and like, glass child is they're seen through, right? And so I think that kind of applies here too. If a child is struggling with substance use, a teen, an adolescent, parents' attention is focused on how do we make sure that this doesn't continue to be an issue. And that can often leave siblings feeling like, what about me? And it makes sense that, we have to dedicate maybe more attention to this child who is struggling, but it does often leave the siblings feeling abandoned or neglected. So that's definitely an issue.
So in your overview of this whole area, Colleen, you brought up race and other factors. So if someone's an addict, they're in the criminal justice system, is everybody, how much does race and other factors such as that affect how they're treated and what ultimately happens with them?
So yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, we know that race and socioeconomic status, education level, all of those things are related to people's involvement in the criminal justice system, in the sense that it's not so much a higher likelihood that someone is going to offend, but it's a higher likelihood that they're going to be arrested, that they're going to be tried. Their cases end up in the criminal justice system, and they're more likely to end up with more punitive outcomes at sentencing as well. And so it's not so much that there's specific kind of proportions of the population in any society maybe that are going to be more likely to offend. It's really just who gets caught and their case ends up going through the criminal justice system. And so that's why we see, disproportionately, young Black and Hispanic men, mostly in the criminal justice system as compared to young white men or white women. When it comes to addiction and when it comes to substance abuse, there are a lot of also assumptions. So I mean, I've done a lot of work on how people think about drug laws in the United States, how they think about drug use, and how they want to think about some of these things in relation to sentencing or medical treatment or aftercare or whatever it might be. And there are a lot of stigmas that are associated with that as well, in the sense that there are assumptions that people who are doing, let's say, have opioid addiction, for example, that if you're white, you're probably going to be more likely to be using prescription medication as compared to heroin. And then the opposite would be for someone who's Hispanic or who is African American. And so there are constant assumptions based on decades and decades of very problematic and ineffective drug laws, and a lot of public rhetoric, a lot of media coverage of high-profile cases has caused a lot of these issues, where there's a lot of assumptions about the type of drug that people are using. Obviously, the 80s with the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine issue with disproportionate sentencing and things like that. All of that has continued to go through the criminal justice system. And then we've also seen, just thinking about drug trafficking and other things that are, you know, kind of combined with addiction. They're not explicitly related to always drug use, but are related to supplying drugs and being involved in drug trade. Those are also very much tied into those kind of disproportionate, sentencing outcomes that we see for drug use. So it does matter. It does create a lot of false assumptions. And it also means that when people go to, you know, get to that stage at sentencing, people with certain characteristics, if they're there and they have an addiction disorder, they're, you know, whether it be related to direct drug use or related to drug trade or trafficking, people with certain characteristics are going to have, unfortunately, a much higher likelihood to end up incarcerated, and not necessarily be extended things like drug courts or treatment, or other types of rehabilitative strategies or services, just because of their backgrounds. So it's there. Unfortunately, it continues to affect outcomes today.
So in the criminal justice system itself, sometimes people either voluntarily or even asked to go to rehab, right?
Yeah.
How are the rehab places vetted? Are they?
Yeah, good question. So they're not most of the time, in the sense that a lot of the time there are some of it is not, you know, potentially some of the services' fault. A lot of it has to do with funding, and issues with funding and resources. But yes, there are a variety of different types of places that a person can ends up. And I'm sure that Sam has a lot of experience with that as well. You know, people can end up in a variety of different places that have different philosophies, have different access to resources, have different types of either psychiatric staff or therapists that they can work with that have also very different philosophies. And all of that kind of melds into success and whether or not someone is going to be able to work towards recovery. And obviously, the types of services that are provided to someone that are state funded or through the criminal justice system are going to be very different than something that might be private, that a person pays for, like a rehabilitation facility. So there's a wide range of types of outcomes that might occur because of the type of place that a person ends up. And again, I'm sure Sam has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I actually used to work at an inpatient drug and alcohol rehab. It was state funded, and it was one of those places where I would say 90% easily of my caseload was people who were involved in the criminal justice system, whether they were there by choice or by high encouragement.
Yeah.
Either way, you know, it's one of those things where, one, the options are more limited because there just aren't as many state funded facilities as there are privatized facilities. And then on top of that, it comes down to availability. So for example, in the winter, if you have we had a high homeless population, beds are filled because people are staying the whole time. So if we're considered one of the best state-run rehabs and somebody really needs to get in, they might not have access because beds are taken and they have to end up somewhere else that might not be as high of a quality. And, you know, where I was at, a lot of the complaints from clients who had been to other facilities was they didn't prioritize aftercare. So that's kind of what we had our focus on was, again, you're coming in, most of these clients are homeless. We would not discharge somebody until they had accommodations, whether that was a recovery house, whether that was a shelter. We did not feel it was right to release these people to the streets, right? Because they're just going to end up back in that system, right? So that was something that we really prioritized. Most facilities don't have the resources, like you said, to be able to do that, which is unfortunate. But then, you know, that's really that discrepancy too of, okay, I just happened to land in this rehab that helps me get aftercare, whereas I happened to land in this rehab that isn't able to provide that for me. And it's kind of luck of the draw.
Yeah, no, 100%.
But even from a private perspective, Sam, it seems to me that not all recovery centers or programs are created equal. I mean,
Definitely.
You know, one of them I looked at kind of reminded me of Outward Bound, you know, where you're like go hiking in the woods, and others are, you know, kind of lush facilities by the ocean, and others are not. But are they created equal? Are there some bedrock principles they all cover, or no?
I think a lot of them, I mean, from my experience, most rehabs structure is similar, where it's, you know, you're getting up at a certain time, you have group programming throughout the day. What happens in those groups is dependent on the facility. I know a lot of them will bring in AA and NA speakers. A lot of them push 12-step meetings and engagement. So they want to make sure that clients are having access to that while they're inpatient, so that when they get out, they're comfortable and know how to engage with that resource. But it really does differ. And, you know, for example, those higher end luxury rehabs down in Florida on the beach, they're more expensive. And I don't know necessarily what the quality of treatment is compared to, you know, just your run of the mill private facility. You're paying for the experience, but the treatment could be similar, could be better, it could be worse. I think that comes down to the clinicians, how much they care about working with this population and what their knowledge is and their ability to educate people. I think also the structure, you know, some facilities say groups are optional and you do whatever you want to do while you're here. And others are, your group is mandatory, your bedroom is going to be locked for the duration of the day. You're here for programming and you're going to be in programming. And some of that comes down to your insurance requirements too. If insurance is paying for me to be here, they want to make sure that I'm engaging in treatment. Whereas those private facilities that are maybe pay out of pocket, they have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what services they can offer and how to kind of structure their programs.
Now, when we actually became aware of you, Colleen, it was originally an article in which you were quoted, but in that article, it talked about another person. In fact, it says one person who was quoted in the article said, "As a parent, I would have cut off both of my arms to save my kids."
Yeah.
This woman was from Vacaville, California. She took out
actually, I am from right near there. It's actually it was very coincidental. I am originally from literally 5 minutes away from there. So it's very funny.
My goodness. My goodness. All right. So she took out a second mortgage and essentially lost her home covering treatment costs.
Yeah.
She said, "This is a health crisis. It's not a moral failing. It's not a family screw up. It's an illness." I'd like to have both of you kind of respond to what this woman from Vacaville, California was saying.
You know, I mean, it's incredibly sad, and it's so hard. I mean, as we've been talking about, you know, addiction, it develops through a variety of different circumstances, influences, experiences. Family members love their loved ones for obvious reasons. They are this person's, you know, the son, this person's daughter. You want to do everything you possibly can to try to help. But what's really difficult is, and it talks about it in the article, and, you know, there's a lot of research to suggest that it's, again, not a linear pathway. And so people who don't necessarily have a lot of resources or have some resources, and you see this, again, not just with people who are supporting a loved one with addiction, but also just people who their loved ones become involved in the criminal justice system, putting up their house for collateral for bail, like putting up a huge amount of resources and time and energy trying to help their loved one move forward in their circumstances. And with addiction, because it's not linear, it means that you cannot, as much as you want to, control that person's narrative. You know, there's a lot of rhetoric that talks about like the person will recover when they want to and things like that. Part of that is true. Part of that is a variety of other circumstances. But yeah, it's about 7 times, and Sam will know this research better than I do, that a person has to fail to try to become clean and to go through recovery to have it begin to stick. And it's not something that is done in the sense that when you've recovered for a period of time, that this journey is over. I've known people in my life who struggled with addiction, and they say it's a constant struggle every single day. It is a constant, it's maintenance for that. And so to have family members try to, with their ability, they want to help their loved one recover, to use those types of resources, it doesn't mean that if you have the resources, it's going to help. It's going to happen. And so, you know, someone who is able to put up their house is, you know, that's great that they have those resources, but then that person might lose their house, as compared to someone who might have be very, very wealthy, and they might be able to put their loved one through rehab 7 times. Even though the resources might be different in those situations, the narrative might be very similar. And so there's a variety of things you try to control during that situation with your loved one and their process of recovery, but there's only so much you can do. And again, I'm sure Sam has so many personal experiences from the people that she's treated that she's seen those things.
Yeah, I was going to say my drug and alcohol background is going to show, because I think this is one of those things where people think, well, if I can just get them to rehab, if I can just afford this and do that, then they'll be healed or fixed or cured or whatever the case may be. And we actually know that that's not true, because it is up to the person, right? Obviously, access to resources does make a difference, but at the end of the day, it's the person themselves who needs to be putting in the work to recover. And there's this fine line between family support and family enabling, right? So if I, as a family member, am constantly telling my family member to go to rehab and to do this, and I'm getting them there, and maybe they don't see that they have a problem yet, or they're not ready to change, that's not going to do anything, right? Them going to rehab when they don't want to be there and they're just going because I said that I want them to go, they're not going to necessarily benefit in the way that they would if they said, listen, I have a problem and I need to go get help. And so sometimes family members obviously are acting with the best intentions, right? I love this person. I want them to be okay. I think that by getting them help, that's going to fix everything and make everything better. In reality, sometimes it keeps the person stuck in that cycle because, well, if I have this problem, my family member is just going to come bail me out, right? And, you know, sometimes people do need to experience the consequences of their actions, whether that is, I don't have a place to stay, or I am in jail and I'm not getting bailed out. So it's really difficult, and there's no blanket statement for this. It's definitely a case-by-case situation where, you know, what is that line, and how do family members know at what point do I have to take care of myself and say, listen, this is too emotionally taxing on me, and I'm now sacrificing the rest of my family, myself, my security in order to help a loved one. Like, how do you navigate that? And it's really difficult.
Yeah.
It's it is very difficult. I could see myself in this particular situation being a little less generous than this particular woman was, because I would be sitting here saying, how am I going to live the rest of my life if I've given up all my resources for my child? By the same token, if you know, through tough love or support or whatever, you know, I drew a hard line, I'm also wondering, where are they spending the night? I mean, it could be 100 degrees out, it could be 0 degrees out. Where are they spending the night? They're not in some nice house.
That's the hardest part as a family member, right? Is, are you acting to help this person out of concern for them, or out of concern for yourself and your ability to handle the consequences and the emotions involved, right? So it is really challenging to say, you know what, I can't have you here. Maybe you have other kids in the house where it's, I can't have you in my home using under my roof where there's other children. You cannot stay here. And of course, that's a heartbreaking decision for a parent to have to make, to say you can't stay here. But there's other things to be considering too. And, you know, sometimes having a place to put those feelings would be helpful, so that that parent or loved one can, again, get their own support to navigate the feelings of, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm abandoning my child because I told them they couldn't stay here. In reality, that's a boundary, right? That this person is setting, saying, I need to protect myself and my sanity and my feelings and the rest of my family. Again, it's an impossible decision to make, but that's also where family support is going to come in and be super, super important.
So when you think about the legal system, the judges, what should families do, if particularly if judges are going to have some bias in certain cases? I'd want to give my child or my family member, my spouse, whatever, significant other, the best opportunity. Am I trying to position myself or position my loved one in the legal system? What do I do with the information that you've got?
So, I mean, I think that, judges, especially for thinking about kind of who is the characteristic person who becomes involved in the legal system, most of the time we're looking at teenagers and people in their 20s. Having family support is something that judges do look for. I've talked to judges in a variety of contexts, not necessarily related to addiction, but in talking about different types of defendants, the types of qualities that they look for. And that is one thing that they do talk about. Seeing parents, seeing families show up and provide that support gives them peace of mind, because they do understand. And again, it's hard because, I study the criminal justice system. We always think, and we talk about the criminal justice system as, what happens to them inside, but the huge majority of people, regardless of what offense they've committed, are going to come out. And at some point, they will not be involved in the criminal justice system at all, whether it be they've been paroled and they've at this point been, it's been 10 years and now they're off, or they've finished probation. And at that point, they have to exist in society, and they only can do that through the support of their communities and their families. We've done a really bad job in the United States, and a lot of other places have too, about providing people services and support when they've been released, or after they've gone through the court process. And that's something that people really struggle with. And we know that those struggles lead to recidivism and lead to people falling back into the same paths and social circles and experiences they did previously. So showing up matters. That's really important. Another thing that judges also worry about, and this is not only for people who go through the traditional criminal justice process, but also people who experience drug courts or other types of specialty courts, where they're able to get services and potentially expunge their record because they are able to complete the program. And most of the time, especially with drug courts, it's about treating addiction. It's about treating the issues that they have with the substance that they're involved with. But those can be very, very difficult as well, because they also involve structure. They involve travel sometimes. So, I mean, I've sat in on some of them before. And, sometimes people will be late or have to miss court dates because they live 2.5 hours away from where they need it to be. And they missed the bus. They don't have enough money for a car. They don't have the ability to be able to get a ride. And so all of that can help an individual move forward in their recovery process, or in their ability to kind of address the issues that made them involved in the criminal justice system, if they are able to have familial and social support. So a lot of people don't have that. That's just an unfortunate part of their lives. They just don't have someone in their life, whether that be a parent or a family member or a friend, or anything that allows them to have that type of social support. If it exists, having that is instrumental in helping a person not only navigate the criminal justice system successfully, but also allow them to address their addiction and receive the types of services that they need.
Sam, same question.
Yeah.
Family interactions.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think a hard part with that too, because that's 100% accurate in my experience as well. And I think another complicating factor is a lot of times family members have been dealing with their loved one's addiction for years and years and years, even prior to being involved in the criminal justice system. So oftentimes people are losing their family support, honestly, because of that stigma too of, okay, I, as a family member, don't know how to help you, or I can't help you.
You're fed up. Yeah, it makes sense. You throw up your hands and I can't do this anymore. And so you're like, you're on your own.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that, loss of family support can lose motivation for people too, right? Well, I don't have anybody on the outside to go home to. So what's the point, right? And I think it can, cause a lot of issues mental health wise too for people when they lose their family support. And that was something when I was working inpatient, again, we had a lot of people who our job was to try to engage the family and say, hey, your loved one is here. We can offer family sessions. Like, what's the support going to look like when they get out? We would kind of give education to the family members too of, your two modes should be positive and neutral, right? Because negative is not helping anybody, but you're still allowed to set your boundaries. And again, I think that's the hard part for family members is navigating. How do I hold my own boundaries and not feel guilty about that while also supporting my loved one who's going through this process.
Colleen, you brought up other countries, and if I remember your research, you actually did do research on multiple countries for certain aspects of addiction or whatever it may be relative to the legal system. But if I remember correctly, there was something in there about Australia. I think you had something in there about England. But what have you seen in other countries that is better or worse than what we're dealing with in the United States?
Sure. So, I mean, in other countries, there are different perceptions of addiction and drug use. So obviously there is legally, there are different recognitions of certain drugs being legal or not legal, and therefore use is treated differently. And that means that the scope and perspective about how to treat someone's substance abuse is different. So if a person, is abusing something that is legalized, that is something that is going to be treated outside of a criminal justice context. And so that means that there's just a whole other kind of perspective that might be taken. And there might be more of a focus on that medical care or health care as compared to using the criminal justice system, which unfortunately in the United States, we rely on. And again, it's not just for addiction, it's generally related to mental health disorders. When something happens, who do we call that's related to a psychiatric diagnosis? Most of the time it's the police. That person becomes involved in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is not equipped to provide those types of services, and things just devolve from there. Or they've already devolved, but they continue to devolve, I guess, from that perspective. In my experience, I did a study with some academics in Germany about how people people who work in the German criminal justice system think about addiction, and we found that they think very similarly to people here in the United States. I think that how people view addiction, understanding its etiology, understanding that it's affected by these host of factors, it's pretty well recognized throughout the world now, because we have such great, robust biological, neuroscientific, other types of evidence about addiction and where it comes from. There is potentially more openness to treating it, again, from a medical perspective from other countries. And again, that I think for us, it largely is influenced by our history with drugs in the United States and drug laws. We still cannot get over the way we've framed drugs and like the war on drugs and all the rhetoric from the 70s and 80s. We continue to carry that today, not only in our criminal justice system, but how we as a society talk about drugs. And we've come a lot farther in the sense that there's a lot of really great evidence of public opinion polls in the last 20 years or so to show that people are much more accepting of other people who abuse drugs and also have addiction and do not feel the type of stigmatization that they did 40 years ago. There is still stigmatization, but it is significantly less than it used to be. But the criminal justice system has not caught up to that. And, there are some polls to show that, people think that some hard drugs should be legalized because we spend so much money in the United States attempting to combat illegal drug use, even in very, very small quantities. And people think that should be used to help healthcare and help, medicalized approaches, and doing that in a healthcare setting as compared to a criminal justice setting. And so other countries are better at that now. They are just better, and part of that has to do with culture. Part of that has to do with resources. Part of that has to do with kind of public acceptance. But yes, there are other places in the world who have advanced that kind of philosophy about treating addiction as a healthcare and medical issue, which it is first and foremost, as compared to here, where we do perceive it and frame it in that regard, but this criminalized aspect of it is still very overwhelming when we talk about how to handle it.
Yeah, I think it's Portugal.
It's Portugal, yeah.
Decriminalized all substances, right? So, and I think their opioid overdose rate decreased like 80%, or astronomically high number, yes. Right? And kind of the point there is when you criminalize a mental health disorder, you're not actually getting to the root of the problem, right? So by decriminalizing possession and use, you're not decriminalizing, the other addictive behaviors like stealing or assault or things like that. You're purely decriminalizing the use and the possession of the substance itself.
Yeah.
That opens up more opportunities for these people to get help rather than ending up in the criminal justice system.
Yeah. And I was going to say, so with drug courts, I've mentioned them before. They've been around for a significant period of time. The first drug courts started in the very early 90s in Miami and have now, cascaded across the country. There's still not that many of them when it comes to thinking about how large the criminal justice system is and how many, courts there are and how many entities that potentially could allow for a drug court to be developed. There is a lot of mixed evidence related to drug courts. And again, drug courts are really about focusing on treating the underlying reason why a person has ended up in the criminal justice system. And usually that's related to drug use, and that's usually related to addiction. And that provides sometimes services that a person wouldn't be able to get otherwise. The structure of the program can be very helpful. So there are a lot of benefits. But there are also a lot of drawbacks. And that's why the evidence isn't so great in the sense that when you look at efficacy and you look at recidivism rates, they have a lot of problems with aftercare, as we were talking about before, and providing structure after going through the program. And then the other thing is that they also are very limited in scope in the sense that only until very recently, most of the courts only accepted relatively low level offenses. And so if someone had committed a pretty high level offense, something that was very violent or something that was a certain level of felony, depending on the jurisdiction, then that person would not be eligible for drug court regardless of what their background is or the kind of support that they would have. And so there are a lot of structural barriers and impediments that the criminal justice system provides far beyond just kind of the traditional structure. That means that people with addiction aren't necessarily getting the services that they need.
So, Sam, when you think about addiction and you think about recovery, there's different levels, different stages of that recovery. Can you kind of like lay that out for us so that we know what the stages are, where people are, and then where you live?
Yeah. I mean, as a therapist trained in drug and alcohol, we kind of learned the stages of change, as they call them. So it's kind of a way to gauge somebody's interest in changing. And it goes from pre-contemplation. The stages are named pretty much what they are, right? Pre-contemplation, I'm not even contemplating changing. I don't think that I have a problem. I don't know that I have a problem. Contemplation is, okay, I know that there's something negative happening here with my substance use, but I'm not really ready to admit that it's a full-blown problem or that I'm, ready to change. Then you have preparation, where the individual is like, okay, this is a problem. It's negatively impacting my life. I need to do something about it. This is usually the phase where people are voluntarily going to rehab. And then you have action, which is I'm actively doing the things to recover. And then maintenance is I am recovering. I am continuing in that journey of recovery. We used to tell people when we worked inpatient, 3 to 6 months sober at that point, we can consider you in maintenance. You're doing all the things, you're maintaining your sobriety, you're engaging in recovery supports, whether that's 12-step meetings, whether that's other peer support groups, whether that's therapy, right? And our job as therapists is to meet the client where they're at in whatever stage they're in and helping them to make the progress to the next stage by their own choice. So somebody who doesn't recognize that their substance use is a problem, our job is to create that dissonance and say, okay, well, you say that your alcohol use isn't a problem, but you got a DUI last week. Tell me how that makes sense, right? And try to get people to see, oh, okay, yeah, that's a consequence of my substance use. And, it sounds simple, but it really is one of those things where, addiction is a disease. It's a mental disorder. So we'll say that's the addiction talking, telling you that, oh, well, it was just one time and, I won't do it again. And so it's really interesting to see, how people move through those stages. And then more recent research has shown that people need continuing support further than just your inpatient, 30-day stay. Usually people will then drop down to like an intensive outpatient program for a couple weeks to a couple months. And then at that point, most of the time they say, okay, go and, you know, go to meetings, and that's it. And so this is kind of where the Addiction Recovery Center of Excellence comes in, is I wanted there to be a place for those clients to say, okay, no, I can continue on with a therapist for ongoing support, so that I don't just stop working on my recovery after my drug and alcohol treatment has finished. And that also kind of ties into the integration piece of, okay, now that I'm coming back into society, how do I maintain a job and maintain my sobriety? How do I deal with grief and loss while maintaining my sobriety? How do I navigate the end of a relationship while maintaining sobriety, the holidays while maintaining sobriety? Recovery is an ongoing process. It's something that these people are going to deal with for the rest of their lives. And just because the focus isn't necessarily on getting and staying sober anymore doesn't mean that they don't still need support to navigate the mental health portion of it.
So when you think about
your question,
no, it very much does. But when you think about those stages, and you think about the legal system, if I'm not really telling the truth, if you will, about where I am in terms of having an addiction, and I'm in the legal system, does that cause judges to look at everybody and say, look at them as if they're lying? Does that color the way people move through the system at all, Colleen?
Yeah, so I mean, in some of the work that I've done more recently, I've been really interested in how judges think about remorse from defendants, and
remorse.
Honesty. Yeah, and it's not, again, specifically related to addiction, but one of the things that organically has come up in my conversations is about substance use and about addiction, and how it is sometimes viewed as this stigmatizing feature where if a person is involved in the criminal justice system, it's a defendant in front of a judge. If this person has a known substance use problem, if this person has addiction, especially if it's a part of that person's criminal justice record, in the sense that there's a reason, it's a part of the reason why they're in front of front of the judge in the first place, there is a hesitance, there is a skepticism for sure, where judges, and I found this with probation officers actually as well, because I also did a study with probation officers about how they thought about remorse and how they crafted pre-sentencing reports, which are given to judges when they're making decisions about defendants during that stage. And yeah, there's a skepticism that this person is their addiction. This person is saying what they want to hear just because they want more drugs. They are saying that they're sorry, even though they're not, because they haven't really thought about what they were doing. And a lot of it is around this kind of essentialism angle that I was mentioning before, this idea that addiction becomes how you're viewed. That is who you were thought of, where it's not you speaking, it's the drugs talking. It's not you, it's the interest in getting the drugs or interest in getting back on the streets kind of talking. And that if you're being honest, they're skeptical that what you're saying is actually honest, even if it is honest. They're skeptical that if you're crying or if you are saying, I'm sorry, that you are putting on a show. It's crocodile tears. And so, again, there's a lot of other qualities they talked about, but substance use was something that they really honed in on. And a lot of this, again, is based on their prior experiences. And with judges, they're human beings, just like all of us in our world. If you interacted with the person every single time and had to make sense of who that person was based on what you know about them, we'd be overloaded with social information. So what we do is we take shortcuts. We have mental shortcuts. And that's why we rely on things like stereotypes. It allows us to provide some information about who we're talking to, so we don't have to learn everything about that person and their qualities every time we meet them. The unfortunate thing is that for people in the world, including judges, when they interact with people in this context with addiction, they often remember all those cases that they've had in the past, or all the people that they've interacted with that have been there and have had issues with substance use, that they've had addiction, and that they've said things and they believed them, or they believed that this person might be showing true remorse, and then they turned around and they recidivated, or they turned around and then something occurred. And so a lot of that background and experience, including personal experiences, a lot of judges also draw on experiences in their own backgrounds related to, it could be anything. It could be positive of, experiences they've had with people with certain, certain victimization backgrounds, or, I do a lot of work with autism. So if they know someone who has had autism, or a family member with autism, that creates a lot of positivity and sympathy. With addiction, that might be there as well. If they have someone in their family that has struggled with addiction, they may have the ability to remember how they felt in those situations and bring that into the courtroom. But most often they think about prior experiences with defendants and how they thought something, that this person was sorry, they weren't sorry, shame on me, shame on me once, but not shame on me twice, kind of thing. So it's interesting that there's a defensiveness, and also just and again, judges talk about this very openly. They become desensitized to a lot of this information, and they only have 5 minutes with a defendant. Judges have such short amounts of time and information to make decisions. And so often they rely on that background. And sometimes for people with addiction, it ends up being based on those bad experiences that they've had.
And what complicates that too is the fact that somebody could be standing in front of a judge and genuinely, truly be remorseful and sorry, 100%. And then go out and relapse, because we know that addiction is a relapsing disease. And they could, in that moment, be genuine and say, I'm going to do all the 100%. Things and really, truly mean that. And then something happens, and that can, we don't get all the context, especially like you said, they're seeing them for 5 minutes. They don't have time to get all of the information. And so it happens in therapy too. And this is something that as therapists, we have to work on consciously every day, not generalizing cases and saying, okay, well, I've worked with so many clients with addictions that you're falling into the same box, right? We have to treat everybody as an individual and view everybody in their own individual context, which can be difficult to do when you've had negative experiences in the past.
Yeah.
So, Colleen, I'd like to ask you 2 questions.
Sure.
Okay. If you had a family member that had an addiction problem, they were involved in the criminal justice system, what's the one thing that you would do or try and represent in order to make sure that a bad outcome didn't occur?
So yeah, I think, again, the criminal justice system is not a place to provide mental health care or to provide services. And so expecting it to do that is not going to be a happy result. It just doesn't have the resources, infrastructure, background. There are a lot of social workers and mental health services that are embedded. And I think that everyone's trying. It's not that it's not an earnest attempt, but it just does not have the infrastructure. And so trying to address a person's issues with substance abuse, trying to get that type of either services or treatment or social support that is necessary before interacting with the criminal justice system is going to be the most important thing. And I know that's hard to avoid, obviously, but it is, the criminal justice system is going to compound those issues. And you're going to be put in an environment where whatever is going to happen is not going to be good for you, both outside of your addiction and inside your addiction, in the sense that it is just not a place to be able to have to deal with getting treatment, getting services. And so attempting to try to address that outside of the criminal justice system should always be the priority. And again, that can be very hard, because sometimes the only way certain people can get services is be making contact with the criminal justice system, whether that be related to resources or related to knowing what's out there and knowing what's available. And again, we have not, as a society, I don't think, do necessarily a great job at providing those types of resources, but having that knowledge, and maybe that's the first step, is having family members and support, people who provide support, and then also people who have addiction, to go and try to find what might be available to them within what resources they have outside of a criminal justice context. Because if you don't address it or attempt to address it outside of that, you're going to be put in a situation where it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to be provided the things that you need to recover. And it's just going to make your life very difficult. And it's in your contact with the criminal justice system and having a criminal record and all of those things. We know that causes so many issues for people. We talked about reentry and how reentry is so difficult. All of that will be just, again, compound the issues that are occurring. So attempting to know what your resources are outside of that context, I think, is the #1 priority.
Okay. And second question, out of all of your research as it relates to addiction in the legal system, what was the biggest surprise?
So that's a good question. I mean, so the familial stigmatization that I mentioned was one of the biggest surprises that I found that I thought was really, really interesting. Some of the things that I found to at least be encouraging is that, again, people are, hopeful and want people with addiction to get the services that they need within the criminal justice system. So there is public support for people getting access to the things that they need in order to recover. Also, there is a lot of, again, really good evidence to suggest that people, again, understand the nuances. This traditional perspective of addiction being a moral failing, that someone is choosing to have an addiction, choosing to use substances, and that there's no biological component whatsoever, has largely been dispelled. And at least in the work that I've done, it seems to be something that people, again, they understand that it needs to be integrated into treatment and that we treat it like a medical issue because it is a medical issue. And that, I think, has been the most encouraging thing for me, just because it means that we're not starting off in a place where we're fighting for recognition that these issues are much more complex and they require a lot of different systems to work together in order to try to address people's addiction. And so the fact that the public is behind these, and again, not just my work, but other people's work in public opinion polls recognize that we're spending too much money on the criminal justice system to combat drug use and to combat what is a medical issue. And so if we're able to move forward and divert some of those resources and think about implementing a much more robust infrastructure to be able to treat addiction as a healthcare issue and a medical issue as compared to a criminalized issue, we are going to be so much better off. Because again, addiction is not going away. It is something that it touches most people's lives in one way or another. It's comorbid with so many other types of psychiatric diagnoses, as people are dealing sometimes with, depression, PTSD, other types of things that they are, they are dealing with things in their lives and they're using substances to be able to deal with that. All of this is really important and complex for us to be able to figure out. And I think that we are getting to a point where the public is much, much more understanding of that. And so we just need everybody else to get on board. And it's going to take a while. It's going to be difficult to start to continue to dismantle the system that we've created and try to divert those resources, as well as infrastructures that may be embedded in the criminal justice system now, into more of a private or healthcare space. But I think that we are on the road there. I don't know how long it's going to take. It may not be in my lifetime, but I think that we are at least moving towards that. And that's, I think, very encouraging.
Excellent. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I'd like to give you each a minute to kind of summarize the discussion and what you need to say relative to the work that you're doing. Colleen, I'll do you last so that you will have the last word. Sam, you're up.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, everything that Colleen just said too, I think was a perfect summary. And I think, there's a lot that needs to change, but I do think we're headed in the right direction. And I also think recently we've learned to put more of an emphasis on the family support. I think for a long time it was the addict and only the addict needs to be involved in the recovery process. And now we know that it really does involve the family. And, sometimes we'll refer to addiction as a family disease, right? It affects the entire family. It doesn't just affect the addicted individual. And so being able to provide resources, not only to the person trying to recover, but to the family members as well, is going to be a huge component to this. And this is something that, I am passionate about, and something that we offer here at Equilibria, so that those family members can have a therapist who understands what addiction is and how it operates, and can provide the support of the loved one to make sure that they're managing their own mental health as well. And so that they can show up to support their loved one who's struggling with addiction while not sacrificing their own well-being in the process.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I agree, also 100% agree with what Sam has said. And I think, really kind of focusing on the kind of, our core of our conversation here, which has been about families and about familial support. Yeah, I think it's just really important for people to recognize that support for people in the criminal justice system with addiction, without addiction, but I know obviously in this context we're talking about people with addiction, is going to be really the number one priority, because we know that people who do not have support and do not have the ability to think about where they're going to come home to, the type of support and infrastructure that they need to succeed afterwards, they are much, much more likely to recidivate, to become involved in the, the situations and experiences that they had prior to being involved in the criminal justice system. And I know that it's really difficult for families. I can only, imagine how difficult it is for people, but that support is likely going to be the thing that helps your loved one recover. It's going to be the thing that makes them not end up back into the criminal justice system, because we know that recidivism is high for people who have substance abuse issues. And we know that if they don't have that kind of infrastructure, that it's going to be so much harder to, keep a job, be able to provide support to your family, be able to navigate just life outside of the criminal justice system, which is really, really difficult if you have navigated that system for a significant period of time, which some of these people have. And so family support is really going to be important to make sure that individuals succeed. Judges look for it, and just in general, it's going to make a huge difference. So it can be really, really hard, but I do think that it's the thing that really matters when it comes to thinking about success in the criminal justice system.
Great. Well, thank you. So let me summarize by saying our sponsor today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services, an insurance-based provider whose mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential and long-term growth by compassionately and respectfully helping clients live in balance. Visit equilibriapcs.com, equilibriapcs.com. You can look for them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also look for me on Instagram, Daniel J. Gomez 24, and on LinkedIn. Now for the disclaimer. I am not a medical professional, and I am not providing medical advice. The opinion of our speakers is solely their own. This podcast is copyrighted and cannot be reproduced without the express written consent of EPCS Management, LLC.